this afternoon. I would like to ask our panelists to unmute their cameras, so they're also on the screen. My name is Alejandro Behr. I'm the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and the professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all to this program. I want to let you know that this program has simultaneous translation, and you can find on the lower bar of the Zoom screen, you can click on interpretation and you can choose language. One of the presentations will be in Spanish, so you can choose English translations there. I will also, se lo digo a los que se conectan con nosotros y necesitan traducción simultánea, en la barra inferior pueden encontrar el botón de interpretación o de traducción y ahí pueden darle al idioma inglés. This panel discussion is one of the 3 events that we are hosting to honor Indigenous Peoples Day and Week. We acknowledge that the University of Minnesota is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people, specifically on Dakota land or Minnesota Mapuche. I want to thank our 4 guest speakers for agreeing to be part of this panel, and also Joe Eggers, the Center's Assistant Director, for all the organizational work that is behind this program. I want to thank also our interpreters, Anna Veblen and Nadia Smith, and of course, special thanks go to my colleague Gabriela Spears, who has gracefully agreed to co-organize and to chair this panel. Before I turn it over to Gabriela, let me introduce her briefly. Dr. Gabriela Spears-Rico is a Purepecha and Piringa cultural anthropologist and poet who serves as an assistant professor of Chicano Latino studies at the University of Minnesota. Her first book, Mestizo Melancholia and the Legacy of Contest in Michoacan, offers an ethnographic analysis of Mexican tourism to the Pátzcuaro Basin during Day of the Dead observations in Michoacan. Her scholarship has been published in Latinx Talk and in feminist anthropology. She has won fellowships by the Mellon Foundation and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and was recently named a McKnight Land Grant Professor by our university. Thank you again, Gabriela, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much. Hindi, Narechusku. Hello, good afternoon. I join you from occupied Dakota Territory in Minishashka, the place of white cliffs, also known as St. Paul, Minnesota. I want to begin by thanking my colleague Alejandro Behr and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies for this invitation to collaborate on today's panel. Every year for the Indigenous people of Abya Yala, the Caribbean, and the Americas, this is a time to reflect and remember, as well as celebrate our collective resilience after more than 500 years post-contact with European colonization. During this time of the year, Indigenous people participate in commemorative events and ceremonies to come together and call upon the historical memory left by our ancestors. Some of us take the day to ourselves and to be with our families. For many of us, it is also time to act. This year on Indigenous Peoples Day, I enrolled in Purepecha language classes with Maestra Ruby Sanda. They will be taught every Saturday online, and I'm quite excited. This will be the first time I will commit myself to learning one of my ancestral languages. I undertake commitments like this on Indigenous Peoples Day to motivate my daughter to reflect on what it means to celebrate our ancestry and make our ancestors proud of us this day and every day. I am so honored to be joined today by this wonderful group of scholars from throughout Abya Yala. With us today are Brenda J. Child, Herson Winka Piutrine, Floridalma Boj-Lopez, and Nancy Paola Chaves. Today's panel, Confronting the Past, Legacies of Indigenous Genocide in the Americas, will address the themes of historical genocide and ongoing erasures as related to the Indigenous peoples of the Americas, as well as examples of contemporary displacements and violence while critically querying where we are 529 years after contact on these continents. Panelists will also center Indigenous survivance, resilience, Indigenous presence, and the pesky code word and difficult process of reconciliation. Panelists will share their research on the long-term impacts of colonial violence on Indigenous communities today, while also discussing and focusing on historical and current efforts towards restoration, recognition, decolonization, and material reparations. The panel asks how we can move forward towards restorative and empowered futures for Indigenous people while confronting the past and the messy, often complex questions of solidarity and collaboration. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, my esteemed and brilliant colleague, Brenda Child. Brenda J. Child, Red Lake, Ojibwe, is Northrop Professor and former chair of the Departments of American Studies and American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. She is past president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. In 2021, she was the University of Minnesota's recipient of the President's Community Engaged Scholar Award. Dr. Child holds a PhD in history and is the author of several award-winning books, including Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families, 1900 through 1940, Holding Our World Together, Ojibwe Women and the Survival of Community, and My Grandfather, Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservation. The latter won the American Indian Book Award. Her new book project, The Marriage Blanket, Love, Violence, and the Law in Indian Country, is a historical study of domestic violence, disenrollment, and changes in family life. Please help me welcome Brenda.
Thank you so much, Gabby, for that warm welcome. I'd also like to thank the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies for inviting this panel, especially during this particular week. And also, I'd like to say what a pleasure it is for me to be a part of this panel with such wonderful colleagues. I'm going to talk about boarding school history for a few minutes, and I'm kind of watching my time, and just how the stories, especially that emerged this past summer, some of my thoughts on that. So these are kind of my reflections. In Canada, the horrifying news that the remains of hundreds of Indigenous children were found at former residential schools is another painful episode in a national dialogue that has been going on for years. But for many in the United States, the conversation is perhaps just beginning. In June, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who, like most American Indians, has ancestors who attended government boarding schools, outlined her department's plans to, quote, review the troubled legacy of federal boarding school policies. As a historian and a descendant of Ojibwe grandparents who attended these schools at the height of the assimilation movement, I've had many conversations with my community and students about this complex period. Recently, a reporter asked me if the United States needs a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address this history. The discovery of mass graves of children in Canada has shocked many non-Indians. For them, boarding schools are a distant and relatively unknown chapter. They may well wonder what will be uncovered here. What has this country collectively forgotten or failed to learn in the first place? I also want to mention that American Indian scholars, including me, have spent decades researching and calling attention to student deaths in government boarding schools. Usually that was from tuberculosis or from the terrible influenza pandemic of 1918-19 that many of us have been thinking about and perhaps even learning about for the first time, given our kind of similar story of the past year and a half. So boarding school deaths, I would say, are fairly well recorded in the records of former schools. So it's not a shock to me or to a lot of Native scholars that this story has surfaced. Indian education in the United States and Canada originated in the same colonial project, one that imposed private property rights in Christianity on Indigenous people at a time when their lands and resources were viewed as ripe for plunder. But it's also important to note that the two systems differed quite a bit in design and scope. For example, Canada farmed out Indian education to organizations like the Catholic and Anglican churches. Here in the US, it was the federal government that ran Indian boarding schools, employing teachers and staff from the Indian School Service, some of whom were American Indians. In Canada, and this is another point I also think is very important, residential schools continued for a half century after assimilation. Model counterparts in the United States began to shutter in 1933. So if we think of this, this is quite a long, another half century that the residentials continued in Canada. I think this is because in the US, the schools had a very specific purpose. They helped the government acquire Indian lands. Beginning with Carlisle in 1879 and ending with the Wahpeton School in North Dakota in 1906, the US government operated about 25 off-reservation boarding schools. There was one in Minnesota in Pipestone. There was also a school that operated for a short time over in Morris, Minnesota, but not as long as the Pipestone School. At the same time the boarding schools were being established, a massive dispossession took place in the form of the General Allotment Act. Here in Minnesota, we call it the Nelson Act. And this authorized the president to survey and divide Indian lands. Boarding schools were designed to re-educate Indian youth who would no longer need a tribal homeland. And so this policy, these kind of genocidal policies, went hand in hand. Though the schools were motivated by greed, humanitarian language about assimilating Indians ran deep. Politicians claimed that tribal life was obsolete and that our ancestors needed citizenship and American values of individualism. And so young people were trained as agricultural or industrial workers as their homelands were being carved off and sold. Like most boarding school girls, my grandmother was sent to work as a domestic servant in the early 1920s as part of her experience at Flandreau Boarding School in South Dakota. The boarding schools were also English-only environments with long-lasting consequences for our languages and institutions. By the 1930s, the United States had accomplished what it set out to do at the beginning of the assimilation era: control reservation properties and turn them over to white landowners. My own grandfather, twice dispossessed, was forced from his home on the Mille Lacs Reservation in central Minnesota to another place, White Earth in northern Minnesota. This is where the state of Minnesota illegally took his and other allotments. And after this, the timber companies moved in to clear-cut white pine forests. So with dispossession and impoverishment complete during this half century that the boarding school policies dominated, it was no longer necessary to keep Indians in segregated schools. And I think it's important to remember that they were segregated schools. Progressive educators suddenly found little resistance to education or integration in the 30s. So by the time of Roosevelt's presidency, even bureaucrats began to disparage boarding schools. Roosevelt's own Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Collier, always referred to boarding schools as medieval institutions. Most of them closed in the early 1930s, though some, including the Sherman Institute in California, remained open, but it was largely to offset the poverty of Indian families during the Great Depression. Underfunded schools continued to exploit student labor. But the new schools, I shouldn't say they were new, they were old institutions, but they adopted more modern educational policies that were not really from the education model. And they began to encourage students to visit their homes and families. The boarding school system yielded a surprising continuum of experience among students. Some were abused and suffered. Other students tolerated it and found happiness or refuge there. My grandmother always talked about the friendship she made and how when she came back home to Red Lake in northern Minnesota, she began speaking Ojibwe again. She and other students, most of whom I encountered in letters and documents, made it impossible for me to view this one of simple victimization, because students, even young children, resisted school policies. They burned down buildings. They staged protests. There were rebellions, large and small, especially running away. Parents, for their part, parented as best they could during these years, keeping close communication with officials to either challenge boarding school policies or to check on their children. After reading hundreds of boarding school letters, I have learned to never underestimate American Indian families. So just to try to wrap this up in my next couple of minutes, it's impossible to reduce this narrative to a single universal narrative. Many American Indian people today invoke the broad concept of the boarding school as a way to build a shared past, linking tribal people of diverse backgrounds to a devastating common history. So perhaps like the Trail of Tears or Wounded Knee, the boarding school is symbolic of American colonialism at its most genocidal. The system coincided with the end of the Indian Wars, and the oldest and best known school, Carlisle, was once a military base. Boarding schools aligned federal authority with the zealotry of religious missions, and they depended on national and local authorities, including police, to remove children from their parents. They suppressed Indian cultures while opening the door to alienation from land, as well as the extension of Anglo-American culture into the lives and souls of Indian people. So boarding school, I would also suggest for American Indians today, functions as a potent political metaphor for colonialism itself. So my last comment, I guess, is what's going on today? What have we seen in the past few months as a greater awareness of this history has emerged in the United States, and even the Department of the Interior is asking tribal leaders for direction in policy around this issue. I would say the investigation may lead to a long-delayed public reckoning, prompting the question, how can the United States make amends for a half-century of boarding schools? The boarding school era stripped American Indian landowners of 90 million acres of land. We have never recovered. And this is an important part of the genocide that we want to emphasize about the boarding school era. Well, what can we do then? Lament the past, or can we move forward? My own tribe in northern Minnesota has been asking for the return of a portion of Upper Red Lake that was illegally taken from us after 1887. I still go up there and I notice that a lot of it is a state park. Why not have that land returned to the Red Lake Nation? The Lakotas have pursued a land settlement in the Black Hills for generations. They also emphasize the state and federal lands in the Black Hills. So now Americans have perhaps confronted a horrific history they never learned. Perhaps this will lead them to confront another buried truth about the loss the boarding schools were designed to abet, the largest dispossession of land in American history. So thank you. I hope I kept to my time.
You did. Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Brenda Child. And now we are going to be hearing from Herson Winka Piutrine, who is a Mapuche researcher who grew up in southern Chile. He studied history, geography, and education at the Universidad de la Frontera, Chile. Obtained a political science diploma at the Institut de Estudios Políticos and a master's degree in contemporary history and philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure in France. Since 2008, he has been investigating, among other issues, Indigenous people and higher education, colonialism within social science, as well as the conflictive relationship between Indigenous people and social scientists. He co-edited 2 interdisciplinary collections of essays titled Historia, Colonialismo y Resistencia desde el País Mapuche, Violencias Coloniales en Huachmapu. Between 2012 and 2014, he worked as an intercultural consultant and project manager at the Chilean Ministry of Social Development and the Chilean National Agency for Indigenous Development. He is a PhD fellow at the National Agency for, at the Laboratory of Anthropology and Social Institutions and Organizations. His doctoral research explores the transnationalization of the Mapuche social movement, as well as the Mapuche self-determination in the context of neoliberal multiculturalism. In 2015, he was a fellow at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. He is currently a research associate with Comunidad de Historia Mapuche, community of scholars on Mapuche history. Bienvenido a Herson, mucho gusto conocerlo y tenerlo de nuevo con nosotros y por favor proceda con su plática. And for those of you who would like to access the interpretation channel at this time to listen to Herson's talk in English, you can do so now.
Bueno, se escucha, ¿no?
Sí, sí se escucha.
Bueno, primero que nada, agradecer la invitación a este evento
for inviting me to this event
que conmemora no
commemorates,
tanto en celebrar
not so much to celebrate
los 500 y tantos años del
the 500 and
colonialismo
some years
global,
of global colonialism, but
sino más bien reunirnos a
mainly
pensar
it's
en
to gather
este
and
caso
to think in this case
en un diálogo de
about
norte-sur
a dialogue of north and south,
y sur a norte también, ¿no?
and
Y
also
dialogar
from
también
south to
con
north,
los
and to dialogue
pueblos indígenas
with
del
indigenous
hemisferio
peoples
norte, ¿no? O de
of
la
the
tortuga.
northern hemisphere of the turtle.
Bueno, quisiera compartir acá
I
un
would like to
poco
share a little
una
bit
presentación
about a presentation that
y me gustaría conversar.
and I would like to talk to you about particularly some topics that we have developed with other brothers and sisters, what we have named the Historical Community Mapuche, which is a group of activists that we are well integrated in this contemporary Mapuche movement. I'd like first of all to talk about the colonial state in Chile and the pillage of this Mapuche territory that we Mapuches will call it Walmapu, which is the Mapuche country. And Gulu Mapu that we see in the presentation is that Mapuche part that nowadays is Chile, and Pulma is the part that's occupied by the Argentinian state. Here we can see a map it was made in 2016 by Pablo Mariman Quemendado, and here you can see that the map is upside down. It's west to east, and we see the Andean mountain range, and on the northern side you can see the the Mapuche Nation, and Telhueche Mapu. All this is called Wal Mapuche or Walmap in a historical sense. And well, linking this also with the idea that was exposed earlier by our sister in the previous presentation, I think that the Mapuche history, as opposed to other indigenous peoples in the continent, is very similar to whatever happened with the indigenous people in the United States. There were historical moments, parallel moments, where the state, in this case the Chilean and Argentinian state, they organized like a military war. It was the army in the 19th century that performed a genocide in the territory that today is the southern part of Chile and Argentina. It was a war planned by the states under the governor, the people in charge in the 19th century. Nevertheless, this violence, this colonial system not only ended in the 19th century. Here we can look at this graph, at this map that I can share with you. Here you can see the colonialists from the Spanish crown and the 16th century, the conquest from the Spaniards, but we can also see as an important fact that we could call nowadays the diplomacy, the indigenous diplomacy, and particularly the Mapuche diplomacy. From the 16th century and the first contact with the Spaniards all the way to the 19th century, the Mapuches at the time, in that historical time, they were able to generate political treaties and parliaments with the Spanish crown in order to keep the sovereignty all over their extent of the territory that the Mapuche people were occupying. The Spanish crown and the King of Spain, they acknowledged through all these parliaments the sovereignty and the autonomy that the Mapuche people had over the territory that nowadays is occupied by Chile and Argentina. This ends, as we can see over here, between 1850 and 1883. Where Chileans and Argentinians historians call this the pacification of the Araucanía. And like I said before, this happened because of a military intervention, very similar to what happened in the case of indigenous peoples in the United States. This military invasion where colonists came from different countries, in this case Chileans, and after that German, French, Italians, among others, in order to colonize the Mapuche territory under the idea that the indigenous peoples, in this case the Mapuche people, were uncivilized people without any civilization. They were lazy people that were occupying good land. And since the colonists, according to them, supposedly, they responded well to the necessity of the global capitalism of the time, they were given a big amount of land that they keep occupying until the present time. A second actor important also during this war, where the Chilean and Argentinian armies were, this actor is the Catholic Church. Very similar to whatever happened in the northern part of the US and Canada, the Catholic missions, Capuchins, Franciscans, Anglicans, they were evangelizing and they were stripping the Mapuche sense of people of the time. This actually, even today, these missions still exist in the Mapuche territory. They are installed there. Another thing to consider has to be with the idea of the rethinking about the genocide in the history of Chile and Argentina. They don't talk about genocide of the indigenous people. Some days they talk about pacification or occupation of the territory. They don't use nowadays, when they talk about this in the judicial setting, about the notion of genocide with the Argentinian and Chilean states. That's why this has to do a lot about rethinking about colonialism, because colonialism in the current Mapuche territory didn't end in the 19th century, and you have to understand that colonialism reconfigurates through history in different ways, actually even today. I say this in the sense that also genocide, not only genocide reduces itself with the genocide in other parts of the world, like in the case of the Jewish or Rwanda, but it also has to do with to think about genocide for the indigenous people as well. Nowadays, in the century, we can talk about the year 1907. We could locate there the beginning of the contemporary Mapuche movement. The year 1907 was a big encounter of the Mapuches in the southern region, Coscos, where the leaders of the Mapuche people gathered to evaluate what happened after the war organized by the Chilean state. And from that moment on, several political proposals from the Mapuches were offered to try to rebuild or the Mapuche people, and it has to do with the decolonization, not only of what nowadays can be called the theoretical decolonization, things that you listen to that a lot in academic settings, but it has to do with the recovering of the ancestral territory. Nowadays, a big part of the colonialism that still exists in the community Mapuche territory has to do with activism of the forestal enterprise. There's a lot to be said about the hydroelectrical industry. The Mapuche territory, you have to understand it as a very rich territory in natural resources. So now many companies have their eyes set on them. And after the occupation of the territory, they want to exploit these natural resources. However, even the state in the 90s, they responded to the Mapuche claims creating an indigenous law, and this indigenous law creates an institution, a state institution that in a way reincorporates in a certain way some kind of reparation for the Mapuche communities and for the reclaim of this Mapuche movement at the time. However, even today, this reparation has not really given solutions, concrete solutions to the demands of the Mapuche people. Therefore, from that moment on, while these policies are created to assist, on the other hand, the state starts criminalizing and persecuting the Mapuche leaders, incarcerating them, sending them to prisons, even killing them at the hands of the Chilean police. Now, how does the state see, or what are the state policies, the current state's policies? We could summarize that in face of the demands of the Mapuche people. If you see from the year 2000 to the present time, a big part of the policies and the governments from Ricardo Lagos, Michelle Bachelet, Sebastián Piñera currently, they have persecuted and they have criminalized the Mapuche movement. And they have seen it as if they were a criminal organization. The elite governing in Santiago and politics, they see the Mapuche subject as criminals. They don't see it in terms of politics, but well, to end and to also be able to answer questions today, being October 12th of the year 2021, the current president, Sebastián Piñera, as you can see here, he just enacted this afternoon a state of exception in the territory of the Mapuche people. Starting this afternoon, it's the military, the army. They are the ruling authority here in this region of the Araucanía, or Bio-Bio. And considering this is a political subject that since 1907 on, the Mapuche people have the response from the state is still the same as it was in the 19th century. The colonial state continues with this logic of the constant violence, and it's the same army that this afternoon, Sebastián Piñera has put the army in the Mapuche territory. It's the same army that performed the genocide and the military occupation in the 19th century. So the idea is how today, in the present time, a big part of the resistance of the indigenous people in the North, in the US, as well as in Malwapu, has a lot to do with the global colonial system. Colonialism, not only it is acts on a local level, but it's global colonialism. It doesn't only affect communities of the South or the center, but it affects communities all over the world that want political rights, like the Mapuches, the right to self-determinate and self-autonomy.
Muchísimas gracias, Herson, por la plática. Y vamos a continuar con la doctora Flori Boj-Lopez.
Thank you very much for your speech, and we'll continue with Dr. Flori Boj-Lopez.
That wonderful coverage of Mapuche history and the picture of contemporary persecution of Mapuche leadership in Mapuche organizing. And we are going to continue with Dr. Flori Boj-Lopez. Flori Boj-Lopez is Maya Quiche and an assistant professor in the Department of Chicano and Central American Studies at UCLA. Dr. Boj-Lopez's work uses a transporter approach to analyze the experiences of Maya migrants as they cross settler colonial borders and encounter distinct racial logics in the United States. Her research examines cultural production among the Guatemalan Maya diaspora, with a particular emphasis on intergenerational relationships, gender, and the production of indigenous migrant community in Los Angeles, California. She is particularly interested in how these communities respond to structures of state violence and understand their relationship to indigeneity in ways that account for distinct experiences across generations. And I'm very happy to see you, Dr. Boj-Lopez. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. So the title of my talk is Toward a Politic of Indigenous Migration Beyond Terror. So good evening, everyone. I want to begin by thanking those of you in attendance for sharing your time with us, as well as thank Dr. Spears-Rico for the invitation to share a little bit about my work, the interpreters for their labor, and to the staff who also shared in the organizing labor of the event, including the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. So I don't typically share my genealogy in academic talks, but I think in the context of Indigenous Peoples Day, and because this talk is taking place with thinkers across borders, I do want to situate myself. I am a Maya Quiche woman from Xelajuno, or what on colonial maps today is called Quetzaltenango, Guatemala. I am also from occupied Tongva territory. I grew up here, and for a long time, I loved Los Angeles because I loved its people and neighborhoods. As I have had the privilege to learn more from Tongva relatives, I can also say I am beginning to understand that to love Los Angeles is to also remember that the earth is alive under and between the concrete and urban city. I am grateful for this land and its original caretakers because this land also sustains those of us fleeing the terror and genocide in our ancestral places. My work is transborder, meaning that I write about the Maya diaspora from Guatemala, but that also means that I have to know and write about Guatemala as well. So I wanted to share a little bit about both. So on the limits of reconciliation from governments. One of the challenges for those of us migrating is the challenge of holding two settler nations accountable. In some ways, the challenge is even more basic than that. It is just surviving two, three if we count our travel through Mexico, settler nations accountable. Each country has developed its own apparatus for how it eliminates Indigenous people, but I will be focusing on Guatemala and the US. In Guatemala, elimination has looked like enduring genocide, from the first invasion of the colonizers to the arrival of coffee and banana plantations, to US intervention, to the most recent genocide of the 1980s. We continue to deal with the issues of clandestine graves, stalled reparations, and the government continues to steal resources, criminalize organizers, turn a blind eye to femicide, and ignore ongoing malnutrition and extreme poverty. However, against this backdrop, Mayas and their supporters are attacking what we call the colonial state from every direction as well. From Indigenous academics to grassroots organizers, to media producers, to land and water defenders. I know that our communities in Guatemala are fighting for their lives on every front. But it is from these strategies and tensions that migration also arises as one of the strategies for survival, attempting to flee the grip of poverty and violence caused by the government and major corporations. From the 1970s to today, we come to the United States fleeing terror. But like Guatemala, the United States has also perfected its tools of Indigenous elimination. For starters, there is the issue of racial and ethnic categories. Despite the fact that Mayas have been in the United States and have continued to arrive in larger and larger numbers for 50 years, they are not recognized as Indigenous people. And I want to be clear that I do not think recognition from the state is a solution, but more so that the erasure under the category of Latinx is purposeful and useful for the US settler colonial project. How does this erasure impact migrants? And so what I mean about erasure is that typically when migrants cross the US-Mexico border, they end up being classified by country of origin, which means that if they have particular needs as Indigenous migrants, those needs don't get acknowledged and therefore don't get met. So how does this erasure impact migrants? So for starters, it means that there's a lack of interpretation in any public institution. That can be hospitals, schools, detention centers. Given the common sense notions that Latinos speak Spanish, Indigenous migrants are often considered Spanish speakers, without a recognition that Spanish is actually a second language. Sometimes it's a third language, that many may know as a language that helps them maneuver in some ways, but not one that is their everyday language. Alongside this is the reality that procedures of detention and immigration are not easily translated concepts. Interpreter trainings are still premised on speaking colonial languages. And alongside language barriers are also cultural norms that shape how and who speaks. And so what we've seen is, especially in the last maybe 15 years, is an intensification of kind of border violence. And this is as a result of Trump's zero tolerance, Obama's catch and release, and now Title 42. And we could go into the specificities of each one, but I also feel that there's a way in which all of these kind of operate towards the same ends despite their specificities. The US government has found multiple mechanisms to enact Indigenous rights abuses, from erasure to incarceration. So what does reconciliation mean in this context where the abuse encountered in Guatemala is intensified by the abuse encountered in the United States? I can honestly say that I don't know, except to say that in this context of terror, it has been Native relatives who have stepped in to hold space, speak against the violence facing their Southern relatives, and establish nation-to-nation relationships that have become perhaps the most hopeful space for many of us. In my own experience, the first person I ever heard speak publicly about the death of Mayan Guatemalan children as a result of detention was actually a Tongva relative. I cried in the audience as she spoke about the harm done to children, to Indigenous children. In other instances, Native people have shared resources like masks and information for the Maya immigrant community during this pandemic. When I think about reconciliation, I don't think of the settler government. I think about the possibilities held by what Leanne Simpson terms Indigenous internationalism. For better or for worse, as Maya people, we also know the pain of clandestine mass graves, of how the politics of elimination is not theoretical, but an everyday reality. It can be from knowing these sites of terror and in sharing our stories of how we have survived it all, that we can build together, so that we may demand more of the settler state while also knowing that abolition and land back are the only ways forward. That is to say, I have more hope that sovereign Native nations will understand our struggles. And therefore, I understand that the struggle for Tongva life, for instance, is also the best way forward for those of us trying to be good guests on this occupied territory. Despite this context of terror, I wanted to end on a note of survival. For the most part, my work in community and in academia, has focused on our survival. It's both a strategy for taking care of myself, since the struggles I laid out are very hard for me to think about and write about, but also because I don't want our suffering to be the only narrative that exists when we all know that joy, laughter, love, and support are also pillars of our continued existence. Much of my work as a result has focused on this question of how the diaspora survives. And I wanted to share this particular project. I'm just going to share the video and then I'll end with some closing comments. I'll stop the video there. I just especially wanted people to see the threading map. So this was part of a project titled Maya Women in LA that had Guatemalan and Mayan high school girls photograph Maya women who self-selected their own participation. So the project was an attempt to center consent and care, since so often tourists go to Guatemala and photograph Maya women without their permission and without giving them anything in return. This project instead sought to honor that Maya women in the diaspora could exercise their choice to be included and could exercise their right to write captions for how these images should be understood. So I just wanted to share this particular image of the Macario family. And so I wanted to share, so for those of us who participated in this project, this was a unique opportunity to make visible the survival of our own systems of knowing. However, I would also argue that in some moments, this went beyond visibility to establish relationships through the norms we value. In the case of the Macario family, they not only agreed to participate in the project, but they invited us over for dinner. They made us a traditional dish. They shared a prayer with us, and we sat and shared stories before and after.
Yes, thank you, Nancy. Please, you can begin again.
Okay, thank you, Gabriela. Well, I was speaking in Spanish because I'm from Colombia, but I have prepared my presentation in English. So now I'm going to start already in English, if it's okay. Well, I want to thank to Gabriela and Joy for organizing this event and for the invitation. Thank you very much. And to Alejandro for allowing this important reflection and this commemoration in the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Thank you to the rest of the panel and to the people that is listening to us right now for taking the time for this kind of conversation. And I will link my conversation with some of the issues mentioned by them. Brenda, for instance, explained us the importance of the epistemological ideology that sustains indigenous genocide. And Herson mentioned the indigenous diplomacy as part of the strategies for survival. And Flori entered in the complexities of indigenous identity in contemporary times. And all these topics are very interesting for me. I also found very important that you positioned yourself. I am a Colombian person who was educated in normal studies, like in a religious school. I went to a university and I started to explore different knowledge in different identities that could be part of my own past. I am recognized as mestizo in my country, but mestizo people in Colombia is a kind of imitation of white. So people don't recognize their indigenous parts. They don't know anything about their indigenous history. So I myself come from a farmer family that don't recognize themselves as indigenous, don't speak any indigenous languages. But with the time, I have become aware of how many of the practices that we have at home are from indigenous origins. And that's very sad that we have to discover that even trying to studying is not something that you will learn in your own family. It's not something that you will learn in society because society denies our indigenous past. I'm going to share my screen with a presentation that I have prepared for today. And I put a title, can you see it well? It's okay, like this?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. I put the title trying to be provocative. I put the title Epistemological Genocide and Indigenous Resistance in Colombia. And I want to start by saying, like, when we speak about indigenous communities in indigenous groups, we always start talking about the past. And there is this idea that indigenous are our ancestors and they are like preserved groups, right? But we also need to remember that indigenous groups are also changing, are also adapting, and it's not like they are pristine and conserve everything. It's like groups that are evolving and growing in a different direction than the rest of the society. And I find that fascinating and very, very important for everybody. I am surrounded in an environment where people really don't know about anything of the indigenous communities. My own students at university live in towns that are indigenous resguardos, and they don't even know this. And I was thinking for today that I would like to address this talk to the people that don't care and why it's important to caring about this. Well, first I will mention some information about indigenous population in Colombia. In Colombia, there are 115 groups. They represent 4.7% of the population, which is about less than 2 million people in a country of 50 million. Indigenous rights and territories are recognized in the Colombian Constitution, and they have received some territories in which they have their own indigenous jurisdiction. They are dispersed all over the country, but we don't know the histories behind them. We don't know their struggles. We don't speak their languages in Colombia. Mainly we speak Spanish, and some indigenous communities as well have lost their own languages. Basically, we have been deprived of our past and understanding our own legacies and our own identities and our own knowledge. We don't interact with indigenous people that persist. And there is a gap, I think, in our history and in our identity that is very, very sad for all of us, and we are not even aware of it. Between the 7th of August of 2018, when the new president was elected, until May 2020, there were 171 indigenous people that had been murdered. 9,000, almost 9,500 had been displaced on the territories, and around 14,000 have lived in confinements because of the violence. In this map that you see on the left, this is an Agile Atlas. It's an inventory of environmental conflicts. In this, you can see all the conflicts that are in Colombia, most of them related with extractivism, and many of them related, located in indigenous territories. In the words of the indigenous communities in the country, they have been abandoned by the government. They have been murdered, forcibly recruited by armed groups, forcibly displaced by mining companies, discriminated and stigmatized by broader society. The territories has been destroyed by deforestation, illegal crops, and some legal agribusiness. And these are some of the, what you can see here are the sentences that they used to explain that in the different territories of the country. I want to focus in one particular region, which is the Cauca region. It is in the southwest part of the country, as you can see it in the map, and is mainly located in Andean territory. And then I'm going to focus in two groups there, the Misak, which are mainly Andean communities, and the Nasa, which is believed that they were from Andean and Amazonic territories. But now they are located in the Cauca region. These groups are very different. They are in the same area, but not together. And they use very different strategies to struggle and to resist the government and the violence in the country. The story that these two groups have of resistance is very long. And they have used many strategies through the years, and they have adapted to many different political regimes through the years. But I want to address the conversation today about what happened in the last year, this year. And this year, the Misak community, well, since 2020, they started by throwing down the statue of one of the conquerors in Popayan. And this conqueror, this statue was located in an indigenous sacred territory. It was located there 100 years ago to celebrate the 400 years of the invasion of the Abya Yala. And they decided to throw it down, but before that they did a trial. And in this trial, Belalcázar, which is the name of the conqueror, was accused of genocide dispossession, land grabbing, as well as physical and cultural disappearance of people that were part of the Puvense Confederation, which are the ancestors of the Misak. So this trial is justified in the indigenous jurisdiction that they have, and also in the ILO Convention. So it gives them a political and legal tool to do it. And the punishment that they decided to do for this guy is that he should be remembered as a murderer in a genocide, instead of being remembered as a hero, as it is now. And this is a very provocative action in a city which is very conservative and which is very proud of their colonial history. Popayan is very well known for the colonial buildings, their colonial past, because it used to be the capital of the Gran Colombia 200, 300 years ago. So they did this, and what happened after that is that the mayor of the city called to offer a compensation for people who will give the information of who were exactly the people that did this. I mean, they wanted the names. And what happened next is that many people in different cities of the country started to send a picture saying, "Mayor, it was me," supporting the indigenous communities. Some months later, the indigenous Misak will will go to Cali and then to Bogota, and they will continue throwing these statues down. This picture that indeed was used for this event is in Bogota, and the pedestal that is there, in that pedestal used to be Cristobal Colon. They tried to put that statue down, they couldn't do it, but the Minister of Culture took it down to open the dialogue about this. I mean, why you wanted to throw it down and what is expected to do about this. And indigenous Misak were so proud of it that they went there to the pedestal and took so many pictures. It became a very important picture for them, because what they were claiming, and they are claiming right now, is a different story in which their story, which is also our story, is included. So then we are not deprived anymore of this lack of knowledge, which is our own history. They are open this conversation, and they are making it very visible for everybody in a country that never discussed these issues. I mean, we don't talk about indigenous genocide because we don't even talk about indigenous people in our country. I mean, everybody is so busy with our own problems in conflict, poverty, corruption, that it looks for everybody like, oh, indigenous people is not really an important issue anymore. It's not an important issue for us. Then I think it is important for Colombian people, these kind of things, because it makes it very visible and confront us about our own past. I have worked with this group of people, with indigenous people, and I have learned so much about different ways of understanding the way I experience the world, that I think everybody should have the opportunity to understand that part of the world, but also to understand that part of themselves, especially in our country. Another example is the NASA group. The NASA group are located in the Northern Cauca, and they are well known because of the Indigenous Guard. This is a group of women, men, and girls and boys who are organized to protect their territories and the people, and defended mainly from armed groups. The Cauca region is one of the most violent regions in Colombia. We have a lot of drug cartels there. We used to have the FARC there. I mean, many of the guerrillas in Colombia used to be located in this area. So the Indigenous Guard have a very important position, because it took a non-violent resistant approach to the conflict, which is to give an example to how we can deal with our difference in a different way, even in a context of extreme conflict, and they decided to go for using non-violent strategies. They have been recognized internationally because of their actions. And we had this huge strike in April of this year, as many of you could heard in the news. We have a huge confrontation, especially in Cali. This started on the 28th of April. On the May 3rd, the Minga, which is the reunion of indigenous people, came to support the strike in the city in Cali, and many members of the Indigenous Guard joined the barricades that were created in different marginalized territories. On May 9th, civilians armed with handguns attacked a group of guards that were providing food and supplies to the Minga in Cali. And the videos were circulating all over the social networks. And then what you could see was a lot of white or mestizo people with guns and wearing white t-shirts, shooting at indigenous people, and indigenous people running, trying to catch them without any guns. It could be easily representation of a confrontation that happened 500 years ago, where people with sophisticated guns were attacking people that didn't have any guns. And I was a little bit provocative with the pictures here, but it was recorded in many videos. And 3 days later, the indigenous Minga decided to go back to the Cauca and don't create more conflict in the territory. They decided the strategy wasn't good for anybody to be there supporting the people, but for many of the people that were in the strike, they're being there, like supported by this indigenous group, was really important, because they didn't feel alone, they feel supported, and they show, in this case, a very good example of solidarity. One of the main strategies that indigenous NASA are using right now is something that they call Liberación de la Madre Tierra, which is like making the motherland free. And in this strategy, what they do is that they go to agribusiness territories and they start to cultivate different crops. They have been doing it since 2014, and it has been very controversial. What they promote with this is a different concept of how we should be organized. Concepts that are related more with harmony with nature, food sovereignty, complex system thinking, interactions and connections. And with these concepts, there come different values: reciprocity, solidarity, spirituality, and harmony with nature. So what I want to say with this conversation today is that this epistemological genocide, this indigenous genocide that have occurred through the centuries in Colombia, it means for everybody epistemological genocide. It means that everybody is losing here, because all this way of organizing, all the way they understand the world, the way that they connect with the world and they inhabit it, is something that could be very useful for the world and for Colombia in particular. But we are not listening, we are not connecting, we are not working together. And then we are also killing ourselves. We are killing knowledge that is important for surviving. What I mean is, more or less, if we think about the concept of Pachamama, Nabguana, Umaquigue, Gaia, Terra, that means that the earth, and I'm going to translate here in Spanish, the earth is our mother. All the people in the world name it like that, the mother. And it's a being that is alive, and it's a super organism which is alive. It feels everything, it understands everything, it organizes everything. We humans, we are just a little part of the great conformation that is the planet, because we are all beings. However, the other beings let us be, but we could choose between being predators or helpers. This is a sentence that is in the website of the liberation of the Madre Tierra is one of the explanations of the people of why they are doing what they are doing. So to conclude, what I want to say is basically that with all the crises that we are facing right now, the climate, economic, and social crisis, this struggle that indigenous people are fighting for their territories, for surviving, for showing us other ways of being, is not their struggle, it's our struggle. It's the struggle to be together and to survive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I do see that we have some questions that are coming up in the chat. We're going to wrap up with 20 minutes for discussion here. So I'm going to go ahead and post some of these to folks on the panel. The first one that I saw here is, why do Latin American people dislike being associated with their indigenous background, and what can we do to change that behavior? And I know that Dr. Boj-Lopez was also speaking about Latinidad and the construct of Latinidad. So, so Flori might be a good person to address this question, or also Herson. So whoever wants to address that question among the panelists, feel free.
I can make a couple of comments and then pass it on to somebody else. I don't think it's a personal choice. I think what we have to understand is that, at least in the context of Guatemala and even in the context of the United States, being indigenous puts you at risk for violence. Being indigenous puts you at risk for death, for exclusion. And I think one of the things to remember is that there is a class of people who are committing those acts of violence. That class of people are elite people who do not consider themselves indigenous. They actually consider themselves descendants of Spain and kind of inheritors of the colonial legacy of building Guatemala as a country, right? Independent, but independent for who? For those of the elite. And so I don't think it's a personal choice that exists in a vacuum. I think if being indigenous was something that was actually, that didn't have all of these negative acts of violence tied to them, then it would be a different conversation. So I think in order to change that behavior on it, that's why I said abolition and land back. Like, we need to get these major corporations that literally thrive on claiming that indigenous people are backward and not taking care of their land and not allowing the land to be productive. That's how they justify dispossession. That's how they justify contaminating lakes and water sources that indigenous people rely on. So, you know, getting major corporations that are doing these mining projects out of our territories would be a great start, I think.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boj-Lopez. Herson, ¿usted quiere contestar esta pregunta sobre por qué la gente latina en países latinoamericanos no se identifican con sus raíces indígenas o lo hacen problemáticamente?
Sí, es una pregunta muy importante.
It's a very important question. Through the whole Latin American history, this makes me think about the Argentinian president, Alberto Fernández. I don't know if you remember when he says that according to Octavio Paz,
muy reivindicado por, en este caso, estas modas y corrientes teóricas de la colonialidad, ¿no? Que reivindican lo latino, pero olvidan lo indígena, ¿no? Y ahí tenemos a Walter Miñón, los quijanos y todas estas modas teóricas, donde lo indígena no hace parte también en esta, lo que mencionaba Paola, el genocidio epistemológico, ¿no? Entonces, la construcción sociorracial y el racismo no solamente existen en la sociedad como tal también, sino que también en la epistemología, en la academia, en la política hoy en día, ¿no? Hoy en día los gobernantes indígenas en los países latinoamericanos son pocos, ¿no? Contados con los dedos. Entonces, es una construcción que tiene que ver mucho también con el tema del poder, ¿no? Con el tema de cómo hoy en día los movimientos indígenas están cuestionando este poder, ¿no? Este poder colonial, que se viene traspasando de generación en generación, a través de todas las élites latinoamericanas, ¿no? Entonces, ese es el tema que también deberíamos también poner ojo y acentuarlo también en gran parte de la discusión política interna de los movimientos indígenas en el continente, ¿no?
Muchas gracias, Herson. Me encantó cómo usted y también a Flori hablaron sobre la cuestión del poder, ¿no? La latinidad y el poder, que están muy linkados en Latinoamérica, y afecta esta problemática de cómo no se identifica con la raíz indígena, o lo hacen de una manera que no es para fortalecer a los pueblos indígenas. Another question that we have here is, when you speak of genocide of indigenous peoples, does this mean the physical destruction of the indigenous peoples as in the Holocaust, or is it primarily the cultural destruction of indigenous people? And I would like to ask Dr. Brenda Child to address this question, please.
I'm not sure that I caught the whole question, but I know it's about genocide. And I was reading along, and I know there was a question that talked about, you know, why is it in the US we don't take responsibility for genocide, and we talk about, we accuse other countries of violating human rights and so forth. So if that's what you're asking, I'm kind of ready to go on that one. And I think that we haven't really addressed the issue of genocide in the US in relationship to American Indians, because historians have always told us there was no genocide in the history of the United States. This was never the policy of the United States government. And I can kind of say, as someone trained in a more traditional history, American history graduate program, that was the message my generation got about genocide. And I remember very well thinking, maybe finishing up my dissertation actually around the time of the 500th anniversary of the Columbian voyages, that people wanted to have a conversation about this, historians, but we were sort of squelched. You can't talk about genocide in the history of the US. So now, of course, wonderful work has come out in recent years, especially documenting genocide in California history, that talks about how openly in the California legislature genocide was talked about in the 19th century around the time of the gold rush. But I'm especially fond too of a new book. Jeff Osler, who's a historian at the University of Oregon, has written a book called Surviving Genocide that won one of the big history prizes last year. And he talks about this idea that in the United States, the policy, just like boarding schools, it was always, let's educate, let's Christianize, let's civilize, let's change Native people. But if they resist these policies, we're going to have to take harsher measures. And what Osler says is, Plan B is also genocide, right? And so, in fact, the history of the United States has been to implement genocidal policies against American Indians. But it was kind of always couched in this language of humanitarianism, citizenship, all these wonderful things Native people are going to get. And another point that Osler makes, which I've kind of taken up in some of my work, he talks about an indigenous consciousness of genocide in the United States and American history. That let's not always try to fit indigenous people and the United States into these classic definitions of genocide, many of which focus around kind of 19th or 20th century Europe. But he says, look and see what Native people are saying about genocide in the colonial years or in the 19th century. and even in the early 20th century, because they often are expressing the idea. It feels like they're trying to kill us off, right? And so we have to listen to those perspectives in history.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And I think that's something, that was woven throughout your talks today, is that precisely the genocides that took place were not just, cultural, that there are material consequences, that there was a physical, genocide, whether we want to talk about through violence or disease or numerous violences, but also, the act you talked in your talk about how the act of, placing people in boarding schools and the boarding school policies were also genocidal, and that they also led to a huge amount of land dispossession, which is a material consequence, right? So I just wanted to bring you into that part of the conversation, because I think that you were very clearly speaking about that. Is there somebody else who wants to chime in on this conversation about whether when you speak of genocide, does this mean the physical destruction of Indigenous peoples, or is it primarily a cultural destruction of Indigenous peoples, or does this have to be an either or issue, or can it be all and?
I think in the context of Guatemala, we're talking about both, right? And we're talking about a genocide that has occurred over several different waves, with the most recent one being in the 1980s, where during the Guatemalan Civil War, there was at least a decade specifically marked as a Mayan genocide because of how Mayan communities were targeted. And there was like an attempt to eliminate them, because the idea and the language from the state was that they were internal enemies, right? They were terrorists within. And so they needed to be eliminated. And this led to outright massacres. And so when I talk about clandestine graves that are still being exhumed, I literally mean like graves from the 1980s that are being exhumed now today, right? This work, just because of the extent of the violence, this work has continued for decades. And there's something like, I was just recently looking at this kind of database, this organization that works around the disappeared and finding the remains of disappeared people during the 1960 to 1996 war. And, something like at least 45,000 people were disappeared in Guatemala during that period. They have, I think, found maybe 3,000. And so at least in the case of Guatemala, we're talking about a people, Mayan people, Indigenous people, fleeing an outright genocide that has not stopped. So yeah, I'm talking about both.
Thank you very much. And there was a question that was posed specifically to Dr. Chaves, but I think that you all could probably also address it together, maybe starting with Paola. But the question was, what can people do to support the struggles of Indigenous uprisings in Colombia? And you can also think about this in terms of your particular context. ¿Qué se puede hacer para apoyar a los movimientos indígenas en sus países? ¿Qué pueden hacer, por ejemplo, personas que están escuchando en este panel, en la audiencia, para apoyar a esos movimientos y a esas resistencias?
Shall I start? Yeah. Well, I think in the case of Colombia, because the violence is so direct and is so generalized, it's not even in the news anymore. It's so normal that it's so violent. So I think talking about this is already important. I mean, that is visible, that is still people care about it. That is not something that could happen and nobody's going to care about it. Is important. There are also these initiatives like the Liberación de la Madre Tierra, which I can just put in the chat the website. There are many ways to contribute to these kind of initiatives, and I think recognizing that their struggles is legit and is important and is part of our own country is also very relevant. But yeah, I guess to contribute directly, the best way is to go to their websites, because they always have different events that they organize, especially events related with food, and also in this case, the Liberación, which is very, very controversial. So I will say that that will be the best way to contribute directly, and otherwise just to continue discussing these issues and reflecting on it is always important.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. ¿Alguien más? Somebody else want to talk about what people can do to support Indigenous movements in your area of focus? Lo que se puede hacer para apoyar los movimientos indígenas en su región específica. Sí, Herson.
Sí, es una pregunta también que no solamente uno la puede responder, el cómo, son los caminos, ¿no? Y yo creo que tiene que ver con un tema también que viene surgiendo hace bastante tiempo, ¿no? Que tiene que ver con los aliados o aliadas, ¿no? Que tienen los movimientos indígenas, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, también en la academia tenemos aliados y aliadas también que tienen que ver con el apoyo también desde la academia hacia los movimientos indígenas en relaciones de investigación de colabor y otras cosas más, ¿no? Entonces, en ese sentido, creo que son iniciativas importantes, ¿no? Desde la academia también aportar, ¿no? Con temas específicamente de información, ¿no? Colaboración en elaboración de estudios, ¿no? De estudios que revelen, ¿no? Y la situación colonial que llevan las comunidades indígenas y los movimientos indígenas hoy en día, ¿no? Pero no fijarse en el objeto de estudio que tienen la academia, ¿no? Que es estudiarnos a nosotros, sino que invertir la investigación. Hay que estudiar al Estado, ¿no? Hay que estudiar a quienes nos están dominando hoy en día, ¿no? Se pueden realizar estudios inversos, ¿no? En el sentido de que el foco de investigación no solo es, ¿no? Los movimientos indígenas, ¿no? Sino ver quiénes nos están dominando. Porque ese es el problema, ¿no? De que hoy día los caminos para descolonizarse o para que los movimientos indígenas consigan su objetivo, vemos que gran parte de las investigaciones no revelan por qué la situación sigue y continúa siendo. Porque para muchos de la academia le interesa de que la gente indígena siga en ese lugar porque son temas de investigación, ¿ya? Son proyectos de investigación, son carreras académicas, ¿no? Entonces, en ese sentido, creo que hay que generar políticas de investigación que tengan una profunda, profundos resultados, ¿no? Para los pueblos y los movimientos indígenas en resistencia, ¿no? Eso es como parte de la academia, ¿no? Ahora, a nivel general, ¿no? Gran parte de la gente podría apoyar primeramente desde sus casos, de su misma historia personal, en el hecho de informarse. El racismo particularmente existe porque existe desinformación, ignorancia de los otros pueblos, ¿no? Como ocurre acá en Chile, mucha gente chilena es racista porque nunca ha conocido un mapuche, un aymara, un rapanui, a un indígena, ¿no? Entonces, por eso creo que son dos puntos importantes a poner ahí la discusión, ¿no? De cómo generar políticas de cooperación para y con los movimientos indígenas en el continente, ¿no?
Muchas gracias, Herson. I think we will end with this question. Vamos a terminar con esta pregunta. ¿Consideran que la religión cristiana continúa siendo responsable por las tragedias en los pueblos indígenas? Sí, ¿hay alguna esperanza para que los pueblos indígenas, mientras estén ubicados en áreas dominadas por la religión cristiana? So this last question is very interesting because it spans across all of your talks. do you consider that the Christian religion continues being responsible for the tragedies of Indigenous peoples? If so, what kind of hope is there for Indigenous peoples while they continue residing in places that are dominated by the Christian religion? And I see Dr. Brenda Child nodding her head, so I'm going to ask her to chime in here.
Oh, not so much that I have the answer, but more that I like the question. But I will say that, you know, I'm from a community where for many years in the 19th century, the Catholic Church really held into a very strong position in the community. And I think that's really changing in recent years with the present generation. And one of the things that's great about our Ojibwe communities here in the Great Lakes is that even while the Catholic Church kind of dominated in many ways for a long time, the traditional religions held on, the traditional spiritual traditions. And that's where I find young people really getting their inspiration these days. Not so much they want to join the Catholic Church like their grandparents were forced to, right, during the beginning of the reservation era. And so I think along with kind of the language revitalization movement that we're seeing, that young people really want to take their energy into maintaining our language, our culture, our funerals. You know, even our funerals are beautiful in the Ojibwe language. And we want to keep those traditions alive. And, you know, we have, as Gabby knows, a really wonderful program in Ojibwe language. Ojibwe language, you can major in it at the university where we are. And I often say to the dean, remember that when our students graduate, it's not just that they're getting jobs and joining the economy or whatever, that they're also performing important cultural roles in their community. So when I think of that question about religion and the hold, I like to be kind of optimistic about it and think that just because we're where we are, it doesn't mean we have to kind of stay that way, right? And that the next generation has a lot of different ideas, I think, about spiritual traditions that they wish to maintain and indeed even revitalize.
Thank you so much. Is there maybe one more person who wants to address that question? Hay una persona más que quiera contestar esa pregunta sobre el dominio de la religión cristiana y el daño que ha causado la religión cristiana a los pueblos indígenas, y se puede vivir con esperanza o en paz para los pueblos indígenas teniendo esto en mente.
Yeah, I think the role of religion is very important, especially for the communities that are not indigenous. I mean, it keeps creating stereotypes. It keeps people apart, I think, in that sense. So the role of the religion right now, is the Catholic religion in Latin America, at least, is still important in the perception that we have of our indigenous communities. And I think in that sense, it's still very negative. There is also, in the communities that I have worked with, they have their own interpretation of Catholicism, and they also have joined the Teología de la Liberación, which is as I said, their own interpretation of it, their own appropriation and reinterpretation in a way that is also good and useful for them. So it's a mix. If you talk to the indigenous communities, they have the Misak, for instance, they have a story of the creation, which is based on the Bible. If you listen to it, it's based on the Bible, but it is all based on learning and how people learn, how God learned through creation, how human beings learn to creation, and the role of Mother Earth in creation. So I find that fascinating, like how they can appropriate these things and make something very beautiful of it. But if I think about the role of religion for the rest of society, well, it just creates and contributes to stereotyping. So I don't think it helps for making people together in that sense, or it contributes to racism at the end.
Okay. Well, on that note, I want to thank everybody for participating in today's panel. I really want to thank the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and the staff at the center. I want to thank our panelists, Herson and Flori and Brenda and Paola for joining us today from different places throughout the continents. And, and I think that today, this hemispheric conversation span borders and display similarities in Indigenous histories of genocide and dispossession, but also in the Indigenous insistence on survivance and resistance and resilience. And so I think it was a really beautiful weaving of all of that together and quite fecund. And we saw that, in the discussion as well. So muchísimas gracias and everybody have a wonderful evening. Buenas noches.
Muchas gracias.